in international studies in education. And my research really focused on the growing influence of transnational corporations and the way that they're commodifying and privatizing and capitalizing on the sale of education in global context. So really my research was looking at some of these issues around privatization and the commercialization of education, but from a more global perspective. So that's kind of been my entry point into this, and I've been studying this for the better part of a decade now. However, I got connected with the Public School Boards Association of Alberta back in 2021, and they were looking for a researcher that would investigate charter schools in this province. And I basically got connected with this research project through the university, but there was no one at the University of Alberta that really had kind of an expertise on this topic. And the reason why I just mentioned that is to flag the issue that there's been a lack of critical inquiry and research on issues around privatization in the K-12 education system here in the province of Alberta. And I kind of just stumbled into it, and that has really kind of opened up the Pandora's box. And I've done a series of research studies with the Public School Boards Association of Alberta now. And what I'll be discussing tonight really focuses on a couple of those research studies, which focus on charter and private schools. David, if you mind, continue on, thanks. So David will be manually operating the presentation slides. So thanks for your assistance. And if we're communicating a little bit back and forth, that's just the reason for that. I'll also mention as well, I do apologize in advance if there's a large or quite a loud howl in the background. My little pupper likes to make some noise. So if I do have to mute myself for some reason, it's just to cut that noise out. But I do have a lot to go through with you tonight. So I'm going to just kind of march on. This presentation will probably take about roughly about an hour, but I certainly want to keep time at the end for any kind of question and answer time. I think it's important that we have that discussion, and certainly I'll put my personal email in the chat. But I'm happy to be reached out if you do have to sign off before having an answer or a question responded to, then I'm happy to communicate in that respect. So the agenda for the presentation follows really the market agenda that poses real threats to public education in Alberta. So that is the provincial support and policy conditions that are conducive to creating new charter schools, as well as the provincial support for funding and protecting private schools in Alberta. So the big idea that I'll be speaking about relates to privatization. Schools face increasing pressure to privatize services such as student assessment and the development of learning resources. But I'll specifically be speaking about school privatization in the context of school choice, as that is what we're facing here in the province of Alberta. So just to begin, I'd like to give this quote by Noam Chomsky, well-known social theorist and professor, who observes that, and I quote, "The standard technique of privatization is to defund, make sure things don't work, people get angry, and you hand it over to private capital." So that's kind of the key theme that I want to unpack a little bit with you all tonight here is issues around privatization that we're facing in K-12. This whole standard technique of privatization, to defund, to make sure things don't work, get people angry, and then hand it over to private capital. The provincial healthcare system in Alberta is currently subject to similar processes. So this is something that we're seeing across the public sectors within this province. So whether it be healthcare or education, the two largest provincial ministries, the public sector is often portrayed as inefficient and wasteful. And the quote unquote solution often proposed is then to dismantle public education and introduce market principles like competition, school vouchers, and performance-based pay. Tonight, I'll be speaking primarily about, or a lot about the Choice in Education Act, which has put us on a path towards encroaching privatization. The Choice in Education Act is really about privatizing public choice By that, I mean the ways in which the government has prioritized charters and private schools under the banner of school choice, which is really a methodical way to slowly fragment the public system and move us further along the path of privatization. So the name of this legislation, the Choice in Education Act, is really quite ludicrous, however, because Albertans have a lot of publicly funded choice in education, in fact, more than any other province. So we have the public, we have the separate, the francophone, the charter, homeschooling, and private schools that are all funded through the public purse to some degree. David, if you can move, oh, you've moved on already. Okay, here we go. So referring to the standard technique of privatization cited on the previous slide, in the Alberta K-12 context, defunding has come as a result of fragmented funding. So there's only one pot of money. The government of Alberta invests more than $8 billion each year through the provincial education budget. However, in an era of fiscal restraint, as inflation and student numbers continue to rise, there's a finite amount of funding for education that is increasingly divided among competing school authorities, which include public, separate, francophone, charter, home education, and private schools. So due to this fragmentation of funding, public school dollars are being siphoned away to charter and private schools. As a result, public education is forced to do more with less. So public schools, in many cases, and I know that I'm speaking to an audience of educators, so this is going to be very well part of your experience. In many cases, we know in public schools, we're witnessing overcrowded classrooms, overstretched facilities, a lack of educational assistance and supports, higher teacher-student ratios, all while the learning needs of students continue to rise and become increasingly more complex. So as public schools take on more and more social responsibilities to serve complex learning communities, the quote-unquote solution has been a market-oriented approach where education markets are enabled, where they're developed, and where they're supported to compete and supposedly supplement the public system. Next slide, please, Dave. So therefore, the Choice in Education Act that was legislated in 2020 is not about increasing choice in public schools, as we know that public schools already demonstrate significant choice in their offerings. It is really about creating markets in K-12 education that compete and vie for provincial funding. So the Choice in Education Act has enabled the proliferation of charter schools. It's protected the status and funding of private schools, resulting in the further fragmentation of public funds as public capital is increasingly turned over to private providers. Next slide, please, Dave. So what are charter schools? I think just before we kind of unpack some of these issues around privatization, we need to kind of have a little bit of a background context of what we're talking about. So although charter schools are framed as public institutions, and this is something you'll see in government publications, this is something you'll see on their own websites and their own publications, they try to frame themselves, they use the discourse of being a public institution, but they're not wholly public. So charter schools are publicly subsidized, but privately operated schools. They are not governed by democratically elected trustees, but a board of directors referred to as the charter board. A charter board has the autonomy to operate a charter school in accordance with its charter agreement with the Minister of Education. In return for flexibility and autonomy, charter schools must meet contracted accountability standards. They provide a basic education that is intended to be offered in a different or enhanced way compared to what is offered by the local school board in order to improve student learning and choice in education. So this is really key before we move on to the next one, is that the whole rationale of charter schools is that they're supposedly designed to provide something that you can't find in the public system, which, as we'll kind of discuss a little bit later, isn't the case. The curriculum, however, is delivered it's structured around programs of study defined by Alberta Education. So they do need to follow the program of studies that Alberta Education has set out. Really importantly as well, they are eligible for the same per student provincial funding that all schools receive in the public system. So they receive all the same amount of funding that any school in the public system would receive. And this is quite fascinating, because even if we look at the United States model where the charter school movement began, they get about 2/3 of what public schools would get in US jurisdictions. So the fact that Alberta is giving them equal pay or equal funding that the rest of the schools in the public system would get is quite generous. So they cannot charge tuition fees, but they can charge fees for supplementary costs, including transportation, uniforms, instructional supplies. And together, these represent barriers to access for many parents and families. So there are significant barriers that restrict access to charter schools, and I just mentioned one of them, but they are cost prohibitive for many families due to additional costs like transportation, uniforms, and additional resources. The financial obligations for families sending their child to a charter school differ considerably, however, depending on the nature of the program. So for instance, in Edmonton, there's the Boyle Street Education Center, which caters to youth who have experienced interruptions in their formal learning due to trauma or hardship, which charge no fees of any kind. However, that's an anomaly. Most do charge fees. And if we look at other ones, for example, the Calgary Arts Academy, they charge a range of fees for resources, supervision, transportation, and other expenses that in combination can range upwards of $1,500 or a couple $1,000. So the list of supplemental fees associated with attending a charter school make them cost prohibitive for many learners and represent real hidden impediments to choice. If we can move on to the next as well there, Dave, there are also extensive wait lists. Some charter schools claim their schools have 5 to 10 year long wait lists, which they use kind of a complicated lottery system in some cases, or else they can also use basically different screening processes, whether there needs to be a religious or a philosophical orientation, or they do screening interviews as well. So that is another barrier to access. Furthermore, charter schools are not required to enroll every student who seeks admission, and it can impose independently determined selection processes. So if it truly were a public school, as they claim to be, then they would be all-encompassing and inclusive of all students. However, they are not. So if students fail to meet admission requirements, or they are not lucky enough to be chosen through a lottery system, which has become a common practice among charter schools with long wait lists, students are excluded. In turn, the reality is that charter schools demonstrate a propensity to serve niche markets by creating programs that are not effective for all. Moreover, charter school operators are exempt from public school requirements to offer special education programs to students who need them. Again, if these are truly public schools, they are funded as such, they are categorized and use that label as such, then they should have to comply with legislations in terms of offering accommodations and supports and spaces for special education programs, which is not the case amongst charter schools. So before I move on for a sec there, Dave, when people talk about school choice, they almost always mean the process of how students and parents as consumers choose schools. But the point that I really want to make here is that schools are not passive actors in the choice process, and people have all too often neglected the fact that schools choose students. And this is the case with charter schools here in the province of Alberta. Next slide, please, Dave. Can we move on to the next slide there? Is Dave frozen? Well, it appears as though our technical aid is frozen. I think he's back with us. Maybe we'll just give Dave a moment here to see if we can get back online.
Yes, I'm sorry. That is internet at my home, so.
Not a problem. I grew up with dial-up internet connection back in the day, so we do live in a place where that's still the case.
So apologies, I will bring that right back up. There we go. You should all be able to see that again.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dave. So just to back up a little bit, I think it's important to note that Alberta is the first and only province in Canada to have charter schools. So we are a unique context in that respect, that we are the only province in Canada to have legislated the provision of these types of charter schools. So they were introduced in 1994 after a report entitled Charter Schools, and Dave, you can continue along there. They were introduced in 1994 after a report entitled Charter Schools, Provision for Choice in Public Schools, which declared that there was a lack of competition that was the main reason, and I'll quote directly from it here, the failure of public schools to provide the level of excellence in education necessary for success in an increasingly competitive society. So accompanying the implementation of charter school legislation under the Klein government, so this is when Ralph Klein was the premier back in 1994, was a number of educational reforms that focused on public sector restructuring and cost-cutting mechanisms that followed education reforms in Britain under Margaret Thatcher and in the United States under Ronald Reagan. So charter schools and this whole kind of public sector reform, this is a blueprint which has been utilized in other contexts, and Alberta has basically kind of reinvented or transplanted a lot of these educational policies based on what has happened under Thatcherism and under Reaganomics, which we know has had crippling effects on public sectors. But underpinning such reforms was a commitment to marketization, and marketization refers to the introduction of market forces in the provision of public services. In this way, charter schools are an instrument for introducing market mechanisms such as choice and competition into the public sector, and thus are intended to transform the institutional environment in that sector to be more market-like. So simply put, the idea of marketization, which is really this founding idea of what charter schools were based upon, based on this kind of policy and model in Britain under Thatcher and the US under Ronald Reagan. Simply put, the idea of marketization is the idea that consumer choice plus institutional competition will result in improved standards, but at lower cost per unit. So it was all about this neoliberalization of public education in terms of cost efficiencies and having public really being reframed as consumers or clients of public education. So moving forward there, Dave, thank you very much. I think it's also important to note that charter schools were introduced in Alberta in 1994 at a time when governments around the globe were turning to market-based principles to restructure public institutions to make them more cost-effective, more efficient, and supposedly accountable to the demands of their quote-unquote clients. Over the years, however, the vision of charter school movement in Alberta has shifted from an agenda based on competitive education markets to centers of research and innovation as conveyed in two government documents. So the Inspiring Education document released in 2010 and the Action on Research and Innovation, the Future of Charter Schools in Alberta, which was an Alberta education document released in 2011. They did start to kind of reimagine what charter schools could look like. So in the latter document, it states that, and I quote, In the future, charter schools of Alberta could serve as provincial innovative education research centers, unquote. So the idea was that charter schools could be autonomous public schools that could serve as laboratories for cutting-edge research and development to solve important problems of pedagogy and curriculum and produce findings that would help rather than compete with other public schools. However, this idea has never really realized. It's never been actualized. It's never come to fruition in Alberta. Instead, the vision of a limited number of charter schools operating as centers of research and innovation that share rather than compete with public schools seems to be shifting back to the original commitment to education markets under the guise of parental choice. So it's important just to note that there's different philosophies of what charter schools could look like. And there is this market approach, but there's also this notion that they can be looked at as centers of research and innovation. But depending on the government in power and at hand, charter schools can really be kind of looked at or manipulated or legislated and governed differently. And what we're kind of seeing is this resorting back to the period between 1994 and 2010, where charter schools are really looked at as a market-based approach to public education reform. Next slide, please, Dave. So the Choice in Education Act really marks kind of this new model of how charter school reforms can look in the province. So the Choice in Education Act, implemented in 2020 under the current UCP government, has changed the policies and regulations governing charter schools. And the first major change was to abolish the cap on the number of charter schools permitted to operate. So under previous legislation, there was a maximum of 15 charter school authorities that were allowed to operate in the province, though each charter school authority could operate numerous school campuses. However, the Choice in Education Act has lifted the cap on the number of charter schools permitted to operate. A strength of the previous legislation was that the cap kept the number of charter schools quite low. So when charter schools are limited in their number, they can be given the flexibility to take measured risks in implementing innovative pedagogies and styles of teaching and learning that focus on creating alternative educational programs that respond to the needs of a specialized section of the population, and then share those lessons with the broader system. However, when we see that cap being lifted, it's now being run as though it is a free market. So that whole notion that there can be a small segment of charter schools which are constrained, where they have the flexibility to do perhaps more innovative things, quote unquote, and then share those findings with the broader public system. When we now liberalize that market and allow it just to be kind of freely unregulated in terms of the amount of charter schools that are permitted to operate, then that whole philosophy that they're centers of research and innovation, that whole kind of philosophy gets discarded. So we're looking, that's where we're starting to see this resorting back to them as a market based approach to public sector reform. Also, another key reform under the Choice in Education Act was that under the previous legislations, an individual wishing to set up a charter would first have to consult with the local school board to work to establish an alternative program of choice based on the concept proposed. This was a major success since community calls for specialized programming has further encouraged the growth of alternative programs in neighborhood public schools that have adequate space to accommodate more students. However, as a result of the Choice in Education Act, the education minister now presides over the application process and simply notifies the local school board. So that first step of consulting with the local school board, that's been removed. So while this change aims to push the government's quote unquote red tape reduction agenda, it will also reduce the important voice, insight, and consultations that locally elected school boards contribute in order to better serve locally delivered public school programs. So that initial important first step of consulting with local school boards that's now been removed. And again, this kind of falls under this red tape reduction initiative that we've heard within the UCP government. Another change with the Choice in Education Act is that it also clearly specifies that the creation of quote unquote vocation-focused charter schools should be supported in particular. So it's defined very, very clearly in the Choice in Education Act that there should be this emphasis on vocation-focused charter schools. However, this whole idea of the government specifying the development of a particular type of charter school that is vocation focused seems contrary to the idea that the mandate of charter schools is that they're to be independently conceived to respond to the unique needs of learners or community demand. So now the government is actually specifying that, okay, this is going to be a type of charter school that we're going to emphasize and put a focus on our quote unquote vocation focused charter schools. This seems to be a market or industry driven approach to charter school developments rather than a community or a public sector approach. Finally, according to the Choice in Education Act, charter schools are to be treated as priorities above other possible uses for any extra public school infrastructure. So quite often the standard practice now is that charter schools will lease out or rent out quote unquote unused or vacant spaces in other pre-existing school facilities. Now, if there is any extra public school infrastructure, charter schools, according to the Choice in Education Act, are to be treated as priorities above any other possible uses. So they're basically getting first dibs on if there is any additional or extra space. That would be a way to, again, basically inject more opportunity for these charter schools to come on board, which again, really kind of flies in the face of this idea that they are to be controlled and constrained so that they can do innovative things and then share that information more broadly. This is, again, this more of a market-based approach to basically just flood the system as much as they can by giving them priority for space. Next slide, please, Dave. So it's also important to note just kind of the scope of charter school enrollment and what we're talking about. So currently charter schools serve about 1.5% of the total share of student enrollment in the province, which is just over 11,000 students of the total share of enrollment. So this is not a lot. So I mean, this is why in terms of the threat that they pose right now or before the Choice in Education Act, it's quite limited in terms of the amount of student enrollment. But again, there's been new policy conditions put in place, which are designed to facilitate growth and liberalize this sector. So it is quite limited right now, but there's certainly been a lot of enabling kind of policies put in place designed to grow them. So prior to the Choice in Education Act, there were 13 pre-existing charter authorities running 25 charter schools across the province. So just to kind of like take stock of that for a moment, before the Choice in Education Act, there were only 13 charter schools when there was a cap on 15. So they had never even reached the cap of 15, yet they decided that they needed to abolish the cap and allow the market to kind of, liberalize or expand its development, whereas they didn't even reach the cap before. The large bulk of the charter schools that existed resided in Calgary, where just under 80% of all charter students are enrolled. Previously, individuals or groups wishing to establish a charter school first had to approach their local school board, as I mentioned previously, to have their application considered as an alternative program of choice, which could be integrated within the public school system. So the school board could meet this requirement in 3 ways. This is what was predated the Choice in Education Act. So a local school board could demonstrate that such a program already exists for a charter school proponent. They could work with charter applicants to accommodate the proposal as an alternative offered by their board, or they could reject charter applications and establish their own alternative program in direct competition with charter schools. in the region, which could then apply to the Minister of Education directly for charter approval if the requested program was not offered. So some observers have highlighted, because you're probably noticing the massive discrepancy between charter schools in Calgary and charter schools in Edmonton or other parts of the province. So observers have highlighted that there are significantly more charter school programs in Calgary compared to Edmonton, because school boards in Calgary were more prone to rejecting charter applications and set up their own alternative programs, causing charter applicants to seek approval directly from the minister, which then competed with the public system. Whereas in Edmonton, school boards worked with charter applicants to accommodate their proposals and incorporate them into the board, which would basically then stop the development of a charter school, because the local school board would basically hear that community input and then respond to that and then try to incorporate that idea as an alternative program of choice within the public system. Whereas Calgary, the tendency was to reject that application, and then basically they would just go straight to the education minister anyways, and then it created this environment of competition. As mentioned previously, charter school applicants can now bypass this important first step of consulting with local school boards and just apply directly to the minister. So that whole, again, that whole important step of first consulting with the local school board, that's been removed within the Choice in Education Act. So since the government has lifted the provincial cap on charters and has basically liberalized the regulatory environment for them to be established, the 13 pre-existing charters have now grown to 19 organizations that operate 34 schools. So there was a period prior to 2020 where no charter school had been established for 13 years. And now within the past couple of years, 9 new charter schools have quickly mushroomed up within a liberalized regulatory environment. It is also important to note that in the most recent provincial budget, there was an estimated $171 million that's been budgeted for charter school facilities during the next 3 years. So some of that funding is for what's called a charter school hub in Calgary, which is effectively a facility where several charter schools can run under one roof and accommodate up to 2,000 students. So they're getting priority in space, they're getting priority of funding. So we've created this environment where charter schools are very systematically designed to start to grow. And we've seen that in the past couple of years with some of these education reforms. Next slide, please, Dave. So this figure illustrates the types of programs of choice offered by Alberta's charter schools. So we have charter schools that serve English language learners, at-risk youth that focus on arts, girls, personalized learning. But the most widespread distinction among charter schools in Alberta relates to a quote unquote back to basics style of teaching and learning based on direct instruction. So I should mention, I did this research back in 2019, 2020. So this is a snapshot of what the charter schools look like before they've started to blossom up a little bit, but it gives us an idea of really how unique and how specialized were their programs. So as I mentioned, there's the largest type of charter school in Alberta is based on this learning model of direct instruction. So 3 charter school authorities constituting nearly half of Alberta's charter school student enrollment distinguish their specialized programs as a teacher-directed form of instruction. It is important to keep in mind, my friends, that the intent of charter schools is to provide education in a different or enhanced way with a unique focus not offered by the local school board. However, the question of uniqueness is loosely enforced as many public school boards offer similar programs and continue to further develop a diversification of learning opportunities. Moreover, some practices referred to as charter innovations, such as personalized learning, inquiry-based learning, and direct instruction, which is the most widespread form of charter school type, are all strategies that can and often do occur in public schools. So what you see before you, none of those types of programs are exclusive to just charter schools. You come from the public system, probably most of you. And these are all programs that you will find in your local school district. And in fact, you'll see it across the entire province, the public system, these types of programs. So there's nothing really unique or specialized in that respect, which is, again, that was the original mandate of charter schools, that they're doing something innovative in terms of pedagogy or instruction or programs. But in reality, what we've seen kind of develop has not really been particularly unique or specialized, as these types of programs can and often do occur in public schools. Next slide, please, Dave. So as Alberta is undertaking steps to extensively overhaul its public education system through the expansion of school choice and charter school reform, it's important, I think it's paramount that we take stock of lessons from the United States, where the charter school movement originally began and continues to grow, and because similar developments in the US may occur in Alberta in due course. So the first point I would like to make is that there are many states used to have caps, as Alberta did, on the number of charter schools that were permitted to operate, but has since lifted those. So today there are more than 7,500 charter schools that serve about 3.3 million students in 44 states. So we know that when we lift the cap, it's quite intuitive, it makes sense. Once we lift the cap, we can see these charter school programs start to flourish. And that's certainly been the case in the United States. The next point I would like to make is that in the US, charter school laws and loopholes have also created a publicly funded for-profit education industry, since nonprofit charter schools often hire for-profit education management organizations, or EMOs. And these EMOs manage charter schools. So education management organizations operate much like a district by managing multiple charter schools and establishing new ones in various locations, which is not unlike a franchise business model. So that's something that we've seen happen in the United States, is that there are charter school laws and loopholes that have created this publicly funded for-profit education industry, where large education management organizations effectively manage a fleet or a chain of charter schools similar to a franchise business model. Moving on, American charter schools are funded at a rate of 64% compared to their public school district counterparts. So comparatively, Alberta is extremely generous with their charter school funding. We are giving the same per pupil funding to charter schools as we do to the public system and schools within that system. Whereas even in the United States, which is where the original movement of charter schools developed, that funding is not on equal footing as what other public schools would get in the United States. So in the US, they receive approximately about 64% of what public school district counterparts would receive. So the fact that in Alberta we're giving 100% to our charter schools should be quite alarming, or quite telling in terms of the political prioritization of these types of schools. It's also important to note that research in the US has shown that charter school expansion diverts revenue from regular public schools. So there's been lots of research done in the United States, which basically says that when you set up a charter school, and again, this should come as no surprise, that when you set up a charter school in a community, that will divert money to away from public schools into these charter school environments. Also, 15% or more than 1,100 charter schools in the US have closed. In Alberta, our rate is about on par with that. So in Alberta, the rate is at 18%, or 3 out of 16. So there's been 3 charter schools that have closed or have been shut down historically within the province, and that's due to financial deficiencies, mismanagement, or poor performance. So these charter schools, because they're although they're publicly subsidized but privately operated, there is the chance that these schools, and it's not as though public schools haven't been shut down either, but there's the chance that these schools can be shut down due to mismanagement or lack of oversight. And that's been what we've seen in the United States, which should be pause for concern as well, that they do tend to shut down or get shut down at a higher propensity than public schools. Finally, charter school advocates in the United States contend that charters can help alleviate racial and economic segregation in the public education system. However, the bulk of the research in the US has found that charter schools actually reinforce segregation on the basis of race, wealth, ethnicity, disabling conditions, and language. So charter school operators have also been known to frequently use a range of techniques such as selective recruitment, screening processes, and cream skimming to attract and retain high-performing students while restricting access to low-performing and high-need students. So these are all important lessons for which we in Alberta should be watchful and should take note of. Next slide, please. So charter schools in Alberta, they can and they have played an important role in promoting the growth of specialized and alternative school programs within the public system, but with a major caveat. For this to happen, a number of conditions should be met. If these conditions are not met, charter school expansion may actually undermine the public system in a number of ways. So just to finish off this discussion on charter schools, firstly, I would just like to emphasize that a cap should be in place to keep the number of charter schools low so that they can be given the flexibility to take measured risks in implementing innovative pedagogies that focus on creating alternative educational programs that respond to the needs of a specialized section of the population. Successful lessons from these alternative programs can then be evaluated, shared, and incorporated into the broader system to support more learners. Again, that's what we've shifted away from. With the removal of the cap, there's not this emphasis on containing a limited amount of charter schools, which then share any kind of findings that they have. We've seen kind of this market be developed and liberalized. Secondly, Dave, the participation of local school boards in the charter school process is key. So removing the participation of local school boards in an effort to streamline the system of charter approval, as has been done in Alberta, neglects the important role and voice that school boards can provide in promoting specialized and alternative school programs within the broader public system. Thirdly, recent regulatory reforms put in place in Alberta follows the same trajectory of liberalization that has occurred in the United States, which has largely resulted in a differentiated public system and inefficiencies caused by running two parallel systems of public schools under separate governance arrangements. So regulators must continue to work collaboratively with local school boards to ensure that the mix of providers in any context is restricted only to those that provide the best possible opportunities for learners that are in the interests of the public. And finally, charter schools divert resources from other public schools, although charter schools may not be accessible to all students. So we know that they fragment funding. We know that they divert funding away from public schools, even though they're not fully accessible to all students. Next slide, please, Dave. I do understand I'm a bit long-winded, so I'm going to kind of march on here, but what I'd like to turn our attention to now are Alberta's private schools. So shifting from charter to private schools, they're a different form of institution, and with them bring forward similar but also kind of unique issues as well that need to be unpacked a little bit as well. So over the years, legislation in Alberta indicates a gradual development from mere recognition of private schools, that is upholding their operation under law, to an acceptance of private schools as equals in status to public schools in many aspects. So the Choice in Education Act states that it aims to, and I quote, protect the status of independent or private schools, unquote, as integral providers of quote unquote school choice. So currently there are 160 private school authorities in the province that operate about 200 private schools serving nearly 38,000 students. Over the years, provincial funding to private schools has steadily increased while student enrollment has remained stable. So even though student enrollment has remained stable at around 4 to 5%, we've seen additional public subsidies continue to go to private schools. Next slide, please, Dave. So private school developments in Alberta should be understood again in relation to privatization processes. So education privatization is generally understood as a range of policies or initiatives that result in a movement away from public funding and provision of public services towards more control and funding for private provisions. So the policy devices giving way to further privatization of education in the Alberta context are based on three main factors. So firstly, in Alberta, levels of provincial funding allocated to private schools has increased progressively over the years. So Alberta education grants are provided to accredited funded private schools at a rate of 70%, which makes private school funding in Alberta the highest in Canada. So they receive 70% of all per pupil funding for applicable grants that public schools would receive. Another factor is the policy of liberalization. So liberalization refers to the deregulation of the private school sector, including no restrictions on the amount of fees that funded private schools can charge. So there are no set limits on the tuition fees that funded private schools can charge, even though they are substantially subsidized at a rate of 70% by the provincial government. So there are no set limits on the amount of tuition fees that they can charge, yet they're heavily subsidized by our provincial government. This highlights the unregulated, market-driven approach to private school fees in Alberta that are supplemented with provincial subsidies. Finally, the other aspect of privatization in Alberta in regards to private schools relates to marketization, which refers to the conditions whereby the private sector competes with public providers under the banner of school choice. So school choice is a slippery concept, but again, it's really just talking about market principles and market mechanisms, which are encroaching in on public sector delivery models. So privatization processes in Alberta, therefore, have emphasized parental choice and competition between increasingly diversified types of school that vie for provincial funding through student enrollment. Next slide, please, Dave. So these are just some of the differences between public schools and private schools. We know that public schools accept all students, have low fees and cover costs for low-income families, are accountable to the public through elected trustees, follow regulations to eliminate conflicts of interest, and believe that all kids have the right to accessible, equitable education. Juxtapose that with private schools. Private schools choose which students they will admit. They can charge tuition fees at any level they deem appropriate. They are not accountable to the public through elected trustees. They often have conflict of interest with regard to familial and business relationships, which we've seen historically. There's a number of case studies we can point to, which highlight that conflict of interest, and again, some of the loopholes that people can actually make this into a business enterprise. And finally, private schools believe that parents have the right to opt out of the public system and take public funding with them. Next slide, please, Dave. So in 1997, there was a private schools funding task force that was set up by the provincial government to gather views from Albertans on how private schools should be funded and to what extent. This task force revealed that, and I quote, that respondents, this was a provincial-wide kind of survey, that respondents strongly supported the idea of parents paying for choices outside of the public education system, unquote. In their submission to the task force, the Alberta School Boards Association, for example, wrote, and I quote, Just as those who opt out of our public Medicare system bear all or a portion of the costs associated with that choice, so too should those who opt out of our public education system. However, the current policy is that parents and families that opt out of the public system take public funding with them, since we do have a type of quasi-voucher system in Alberta whereby funding follows the student to their school of choice, even if that choice is in a private school. Ultimately, this results in public capital being handed over to private providers. At the same time, again, there are no limits on tuition fees that funded private schools can charge, signaling a free market-driven approach to private school fees in Alberta that are bolstered by provincial subsidies. Next slide, please, Dave. So at current rates, funded private schools in Alberta are subsidized by the provincial government more than any other province in the country. So not are we unique in that we are the only province that endorses and authorizes charter schools, we are also the most generous with our public subsidies being diverted to private schools. So the grant rate to private schools was increased to 70% in 2008, which was based on the rationale that approximately 30% of total education spending is supported by education property tax revenues, of which only the public and separate schools are eligible to receive by law. So by law, only public and separate schools are able to access education property tax revenues. However, by raising the grant rate, so basically the remaining 70% is financed by general revenues of the province. So basically, just general revenues of the province and according to our budget. So by raising the grant rate in 2008 to 70% of what private schools could receive, effectively private schools are eligible for the same proportion of the general revenue funds as public schools, which I think is kind of an interesting note to make as well, that they are basically on equal footing in terms of the allocation of public funds going into education from the general revenues of the province. The only money that they're not receiving are, again, the education property taxes, which by law only public and separate schools can receive. So Alberta is eligible for 70% of public rate for all applicable school grants. Just to give a comparison across the country, Quebec is second, eligible for 60% of what is paid to public schools for educational services only. In Saskatchewan, private schools are eligible for 50% of per student average operating grants. In Manitoba, private schools are eligible for 50% of public school net operating expenditures. In British Columbia, there are two groups of private schools. One group is only eligible for 35%. The second group is eligible for up to 50% of per student operating costs. However, in Ontario, in Newfoundland, in Princess Edward Island, in Nova Scotia, there is no financial support provided to private schools from the provincial government. So there are many other jurisdictions, provinces in this country that do not provide financial support to private schools. It's important to note that Alberta ranks first nationally for the highest level of funding to private schools, but ranks seventh in its spending to public schools. So this comparative discrepancy illustrates the priority afforded to funded private schools in Alberta compared to their public school counterparts. I think that discrepancy really highlights where some of that political will and prioritization, where that is really kind of set. Next slide, please, Dave. So just to go over some of the school fees that are charged by Alberta's private schools. Again, they're independently set by private school boards, and the school fees that they do charge can vary quite significantly. So while a very small proportion of Alberta's private schools do not charge any tuition, most do. So there are some small private schools, predominantly like religious or Christian-based private schools, that don't charge anything. and just take whatever kind of government subsidies they can take. But those are the minority. Private schools typically charge tuition on a per student basis, or some do provide a discount for families that enroll more than one student. But the Alberta government does not regulate or limit the amount of tuition fees that can be charged by accredited private schools. So I should make that distinction as well, that there are different types of private schools in the province, the majority of which are accredited funded private schools, but there are other classifications of private schools that do not receive provincial funding. But again, the majority of them do, as they are classified as accredited funded private schools. So the Alberta government doesn't regulate the amount of tuition fees that they can charge, nor does the provincial government monitor or report the fees levied by any private school. So based on my own research, basically I had to collect this information by just going to the different websites, going through different private school documents. What I found was that on average, the fees basically break down. What you see before you is over $7,200. And I should also point out that these were calculations that I did back in 2021. So I know for a fact private school fees across the province have increased, certainly in the context of inflation. We've seen those prices go up across the board. But on average, the private school fees are about $7,200 for grades 1 to 6. Just under $8,000 per student per year for grades 7 to 9, and nearly $10,000 for high school grades 10 to 12. On average, private school goers pay more than $8,080 per student each year. Thanks, Dave. So this figure shows the range of fees charged by Alberta's private schools and the proportion of school programs that fall into each price range. So there's a small amount, 15%, that charge low fees under $1,500. And then we can just scale that up. We get to the top 20% of private schools in Alberta that charge more than $15,000, upwards of like $35,000 per year. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those elite private schools here in just a moment here. So so with no statutory, thanks Dave, we're on the right page. With no statutory limit on tuition fees, private schools in Alberta can charge any amount of fees they wish. So as a result, an exclusive market is developing in the province for high-priced private school provisions. There are at least 19 private schools in Alberta that charge anywhere from $12,000 per student per year to more than $35,000 per year for selected programs, which can be described as Alberta's elite private schools. They are elite because of the exclusionary levels of fees that these schools charge that are cost prohibitive for the vast majority of Alberta's population. So Alberta's elite private schools are provincially subsidized at a rate of 70% for all applicable grants provided by Alberta Education, as are other funded private schools. And based on a review of financial statements posted on the websites of these elite private schools, the provincial government granted more than $43 million in total to these schools in just the 2020-2021 school year alone. So these elite private schools are charging substantial tuition fees. So I just want to point out a couple of examples. So this is a collection of data that I collected for part of my research, which basically shows the level of Alberta Education grants that these private schools were receiving, in addition to the amount of revenues they were collecting through tuition and student fees. So in Calgary, here we have the Strathcona Tweedsmore School. So in 2020 and 2021 school year, Strathcona Tweedsmore School collected almost $17 million in revenues through its tuition and student fees, yet still received nearly $3.6 million in provincial subsidies from the government of Alberta. To give another example, Weber Academy, they collected $17.5 million in tuition and student fees as part of their revenues, and they still received $5 million from the provincial government. So these are schools that are charging like $30,000 per year for admittance, but yet are still receiving that 70% grant from the provincial government. So they're getting huge amounts of revenues that they're collecting from private individuals that are paying very high rates of student fees, in addition to the 70% of all applicable grants that public schools are receiving. So they're really double dipping and taking massive amounts of public funds, in addition to charging really cost prohibitive fees that the majority of Albertans just are unable unable to afford to pay. So all of Alberta's elite private schools are located in Calgary. And as part of my research, I just wanted to point out that Alberta is the most unequal province in Canada, and Calgary is the most unequal city in the country in terms of income. So Alberta is the most unequal province, and Calgary is even amplified. They're the most unequal city in the country in terms of income disparity. Hence, I think there's a correlation here. So this high level of income disparity in Calgary parallels the high density of elite private schools in the city. And this correlation should not be viewed as something that is merely a coincidence, but is actually something that is mutually reinforcing. So in turn, these elite private schools reinforce socioeconomic disparity and segregation, which is clearly visible in the city of Calgary. So Calgary has this market which can be tapped into. It has the most income disparity across the country. And I don't think that it's just a mere coincidence that Calgary is also home to the largest fleet of these elite private schools that charge really exclusionary fees for the majority of Calgarians. So in Calgary, in 2019, the median household income was $105,000 per year. So if that's the median family household income is just over $105,000 at rates of upwards of $30,000 per year, the average earning family in Calgary cannot afford to spend almost 30% or more than 30% of their income on these elite private school fees. Therefore, the public funding of cost prohibitive and exclusionary private schools represent an erosion of our public system and undermines the very right of every child in Alberta having access to equally great education. Next slide, please, Dave. So the amount of provincial funding allocated to these elite private schools, which I alluded to in a couple slides back, the amount of provincial funding in Alberta on a yearly basis in 2020 was over $43 million alone. So this amount of funding could afford the hiring of nearly 600 additional teachers or the construction of 2 new elementary schools in the province, serving approximately 13,000 students, or simply that money could be given back to every public school in the province at a rate of $19,000 more to work with. Did we lose Dave? I think he's coming back on. Here we go. Okay. So as I was mentioning, there's been over $43 million subsidizing, which has just gone to these 19 elite private schools, which could have been used elsewhere. It could have constructed new schools. It could have hired 600 additional new teachers. So this misaligned public investment could help to lower student-teacher ratios and or rebuild public schools overloaded with facility concerns. Instead, a system in which elite private schools are provincially funded at substantial rates results in a systematic process whereby essential public funds are being diverted into elite educational enclaves that are inaccessible to 99% of Albertans. And thus, it is a social policy and funding arrangement that entrenches inequalities and inequities in Alberta, as opposed to trying to deconstruct some of those inequalities. Next slide, please, Dave. So with more than $314 million, more than $314 million of provincial funding was allocated to private education in 2021, of which about $43 million was diverted to 18 elite private schools. While it is worth noting that the private sector can make positive contributions to education, these contributions can only be considered valuable to the extent that they are freely accessible, equitable, and represent non-discriminatory forms of school delivery. However, most private schools in the province employ explicit or implicit discriminatory restrictions based on tuition fees, screening, or philosophical grounds, or specific religious affiliations. Restrictive institutions that are private, that are the private choice of a select few, ought to be funded accordingly, that is, by their private users alone. So it is the public's responsibility to fund a public education system that is universally accessible and accountable to the public. Despite what private school proponents may suggest, that the system does not save taxpayers' money. So this is a common kind of refrain or argument that you hear from private school proponents, is that the system actually saves taxpayers' money. However, that's not the case. Instead, it redirects necessary public funds to private schools that can and oftentimes do generate substantial revenues through tuition fees, resulting in the inequitable allocation of public funds. In turn, the recommendation that I would advocate for is that public financial support for private schools, excluding ECS and designated special education private schools, should be phased out over a period of time. So that financial support from the provincial government should be phased out. The argument that independent schools will cease to operate if they lose public funding has not been shown historically within Canada. Private schools continue to operate in provinces such as Ontario, Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI and Nova Scotia, where no provincial financial support is offered to private schools. In fact, private schools in Ontario receive no provincial funding, yet they enroll a higher percentage of the total student population than Alberta. So private schools, therefore, would continue to operate and offer a choice for families in Alberta where there is demand, but without diverting significant levels of public investment in order to finance an exclusionary system. Final slide, please, Dave. So to conclude, I will say that market reforms and privatization processes in Alberta's K-12 education stand out in relation to the rest of Canada, since Alberta is the only province endorsing charter schools and subsidizing private schools at a much higher rate than any other province in the country. These developments raise serious questions about fairness and equity in the allocation of public funds for education, as well as posing real threats to the future of public education in this province. With that, I'd like to just thank you for your attention and for listening, and I'd love to open it up to any kind of feedback or comments or questions. Also, this is my direct email. I try to make myself accessible, so if there's anyone that has a question that they'd like to shoot me via email or just to stay in contact, I'm happy to correspond that way as well.
So just before I take over the maybe facilitation of questions here, I'm just going to ask if Heather's here and she wanted to do that. If not, I will just. I just didn't want to step on your toes if that was your intent.
No, it's all good. Just trying to figure out a couple of things on my screens here. So we did have a question earlier on in the chat. Let me just find it here, folks. It went further back. So it says, is it my understanding that any school that receives public funding must use the government's curriculum? The minutes assigned per subject are also fixed. Is that correct? And so how do charters differentiate themselves from public schools?
Yeah, that is correct. So, I mean, charter schools they are legislated. They have to follow the program of studies defined by Alberta Education. So to respond to that second part of that question, they really don't differentiate themselves. And as that kind of image that I showed before, they do kind of market themselves as providing a specialized or a unique program, but they're all the types of programs that you can and oftentimes do find in the public sector. So there's nothing that you wouldn't find in a charter or a private school that you wouldn't find in a public school. So there's nothing really unique or specialized about the program that they provide. But yes, they do have to follow the Alberta Education curriculum.
Okay.
But I think it's really important just to highlight that point, if maybe that didn't come across, that one of the original mandates of charter schools is that they're supposed to do something unique that does differentiate themselves that you wouldn't find in the public sector. But as we've seen since their emergence in 1994 and almost 30 years of their development, we haven't seen them develop in a way that really distinguishes themselves as providing a unique or specialized program. Because again, these are all the types of programs and forms of pedagogy and teaching and learning that you would find in public schools. And again, the most widespread form of what is quote unquote kind of a specialized form of delivery in charter schools is this back to basics, which is basically just direct instruction, teacher directed instruction. So you obviously can find that in public schools, and there's nothing special about charter schools that do implement teacher directed instruction. That's something that public schools can and oftentimes do administer.
Okay, so we'll go to a live question, if you will. First up, we have Viviana. Viviana, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I missed the first part of your presentation, so I apologize if my question was already answered in that first part. But just kind of going off of your comment there about the different types of pedagogy that are available in public schools, doesn't necessarily mean they are being delivered in all public schools. And so I'd like you to comment on that. So if they are not being delivered in all public schools, should parents not have the choice to find a school in which that pedagogy that they align themselves with is being delivered?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any, maybe if I can just like unpack this whole notion of school choice, because I think this is really the concept that people get the most hung up on, is that I think everyone here is in favor of choice. I mean, the freedom to choose a type of delivery model of education, a program of choice. I think that's something that certainly we could all agree on, and that's something that we can all subscribe to. I think where that issue gets a little bit convoluted is that because it's so universally accepted as truth in the education world, that choice is a positive thing, is that the mechanisms and the avenues to choice is what distorts it. So there's been this whole kind of discourse that we need charter schools and we need private schools to entertain this whole matter of choice that the public system can't provide choice, when in reality, that's not necessarily the case. So what I was kind of discussing at the beginning of my presentation and at different points is that this whole concept of choice has really created this market model of delivery that we need to create kind of a free market where we allow private providers to come on board, and they're the ones that are going to provide that avenue for choice. And we know that that's not the case. We know that public systems do provide choice in a number of different ways. Does every public school have kind of a fine arts program, or a girls only program, or something that is just for Indigenous students? No, not every school has all of those, but within the public division, you will find all of those. And that's where within a particular school jurisdiction, the public school can provide those different opportunities for choice within the division. It's not something that needs to be outsourced to private schools or to charter schools. So I think just to back that notion up, I think choice, yes, I certainly am in favor of having the choice of where to send my student to whatever school might align best philosophically in terms of responding to those needs and those supports, or just the ambitions of those students. But to frame it in a way that we need to open it up to non-state or private providers, that's where this issue needs to kind of be unpacked a little bit, that choice is not something that just resides in a private sector approach, but actually that's something that exists across the public school board, and it can exist across the public school board. And again, this whole notion of choice, it's really created more avenues for market providers, for private providers to come on board, and they can come on board. And I've looked at this issue more globally. This is really an avenue for private providers to tap into those public funds, is through this discourse of choice. So am I a proponent of choice? Absolutely. But my point that I would argue is that it doesn't just reside in the capacity of private or charter schools that can offer that choice, that's something that is provided in public schools and quite often is the case. I hope that clarifies or answers that question.
I do have one, and it's says, what are the implications of Calgary schools no longer containing the word public in their name? Is this initiative by the education minister or just a rumor?
Sorry, can you repeat that question one more time?
It says, what are the implications of Calgary schools no longer containing the word public in their name? Is this an initiative by the education minister or just a rumor?
Yeah, I mean, this whole issue of removing the status or the label of public, I don't know whose brainchild or whose kind of idea that is, but I can speak a little bit to the ramifications of it, because I don't necessarily have that kind of political insider knowledge of who is making those decisions, and if there's pressure, and maybe there's some of you in the audience that could speak to that. But I can speak to the ramifications of it. And I think it's really part and parcel in terms of trying to hollow out the public system, dismantle the credibility that the public system has in order to rebuild it in a way that facilitates more private actors coming on board. That's full stop. It's really, again, discourse and language has ramifications. And when we take that word out of it, it really hollows out the whole essence of the public system. Public education is intended to be a public good. It's intended to be a societal good. So when we remove that, the ramifications, although it may seem minor and trivial, for in my perspective, it has huge ramifications on the long-term sustainability of our public education system. And if public education is designed to be universally accessible for all, if it's designed to feed into institutions of democracy, if it's designed to actually uphold the very essence of our society, because it is a societal and a public good, if we remove that, then the ramifications can be significantly profound. So that's certainly a perspective that I hold, that when we take that word out, it does have consequences, because words do matter. We know that they matter. And that can also have an impact on the political will. It can have an impact on how we just view the education system. When you remove it out, it creates an opportunity, or it invites an opportunity for non-public actors to step in and replace that public education system. So for those of us here tonight and those of us in the audience, if we believe that public education is a societal good, then we should be up in arms when we start to see the very essence of it start to be dismantled systematically, because those certainly do have ramifications on how the public, on how society envisions, interprets, and understands education. So those are some of the ramifications that I see, and I think that they are significant.
I think too, and just to piggyback on that, it's important to remember that we now are starting to see in the last 2 years, with the removal of the word public from, for instance, Edmonton Public School Board has now become Edmonton School District. In press releases, in media scrums, we're seeing the minister and even our premier now referring to public charter schools,
right?
Public private schools. It's a very slight change, but it as you said, words matter, and now it's that dialogue that is getting out there in the public discourse.
Exactly.
Loretta, would you like to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
It's more a comment than a question. It's my understanding that the implementation of the charter school system was flawed from the beginning. I don't think it was by chance. They were supposed to be researching, as you've said several times, researching innovative methods. I have never seen a research report. If you looked at the legislation, it required reporting to the public the results of their research. It required reporting to the school board. It required, if it was good research, that it would be incorporated into the school. They were never meant to be standalone. And this has sort of been forgotten in the sands of time. It was a whole bait and switch.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. I think that's absolutely correct. And that's why we need to take stock of what was some of the original mandates and kind of understandings of what the charter school system might entail. And it hasn't held up its end of the bargain, as was mentioned, in terms of actually sharing any kind of research finding. I've done the research on it there to the point that was just made. There is no such report of such a thing. And they've been in existence for almost 3 decades. So we're still waiting on that. And yet, in the meantime, they've actually liberalized the sector and they've given it another free pass. They've lifted the cap on charter schools, which we could, I mean, again, it's a limited sector right now, but it has the potential to really swell into something that is more impactful or meaningful. So they've been given this free pass, although some of those original mandates have not been upheld to any extent whatsoever. So what is the logic? What is the rationale behind it? That's something to be debated, but I think it has a lot to do with dismantling public education, to reinvent public education on this notion of choice, but creating more opportunities for private actors or market-based delivery models to come on board.
We do have a question from Karen. It says, can they not vary from the minutes of instruction assigned to each subject? Say, for instance, if music is the specialty of the charter school.
Sorry, I'm not quite following the question exactly.
I think the person is asking that depending on the specialty of what the charter has been formed around, that can they not vary the minimum or maximum number of minutes of instruction depending on what that focus is.
Yeah, from my understanding, yes, they're autonomously administered programs. So they have more flexibility than you would find. That's part of the whole mandate, again, is to give them that flexibility. So yeah, in terms of like time restrictions allowed, yeah, I can't speak too directly to some of that, but certainly the whole idea is that they have flexibility in terms of their programs of delivery. They have to follow the Alberta education. They have to have a specialized model or a specialized program of delivery, which makes them quote unquote unique. But the methods by which they administer that, or to what extent or what degree, in combination with other approaches of teaching and learning, that's at their discretion.
Larry, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question? That might be it. There we go. Are you there, Larry? It appears as if you are unmuted, but we're not getting any sound on our end. I'm just going to mute you again and just going to get you to unmute one more time just to see if that might fix it. Go ahead. No, still nothing, Larry. Do you want to, what I might do is just go into the next question in the chat. And do you want to type your question in there? Okay, so maybe that's what we'll do. Actually, if he might just want to rejoin because that might work better. Okay. Sorry, let me just, my mouse jumped a little bit here. We do have a question from Nicole. Although we may get Nicole to unmute and seek a little bit further clarification. Question says, do you think that it's possible that maybe there is a correlation between the fact that there are 20,000 Albertan students on wait lists for charter schools and the fact that charter school teachers do not have to be members of the Alberta Teachers Association?
I mean, I certainly can't point to any evidence that would suggest that.
Okay. Just looking, I don't see any other questions. And I'm not sure that Larry was able to get back. Oh, I see you there, Carly. I go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Curtis. First of all, really appreciate your presentation. My heart rate is through the roof. I'm just wondering, and I don't know if this is something that is easy for you to do, but being that we're 30-something days away from a provincial election, and this is quite a complex topic with lots of facts and not necessarily something that we can come and have an hour-long conversation with everyone about. Is there one key message that you would suggest for us to take away to have discussions with people who are maybe not very familiar with the differences between private and charter and some of the complexities and impacts on public education? I know that's a big ask, but thank you.
That is a big ask, but I think it's an important one. You know, if I don't give a satisfactory response, I'd like to have the opportunity to maybe share something with you, Carly. But I think in terms of having those kind of discussions around the dinner table or the water cooler, if they still exist in offices, I think it's important that we do unpack this whole issue of choice, because I think it is a real sticking point for people. And again, I've tried to highlight how the Choice in Education Act has really been this impetus for privatization processes in the province. And it really does kind of masquerade those processes, because again, I don't think many people really will argue against the principles of choice. But if there was a key message, it's that we need to support our public education system to be the gold standard. It becomes the gold standard. It offers choice. We don't outsource choice to charter and private schools, which is currently the method of choice. Pardon the pun, is to really just kind of outsource that to other providers. And I don't think that's the case. We know that public schools provide choice. We know that the types of programs that are offered in charter private schools are not unique in any way to what you can find in private schools, or sorry, in public schools. So I think the real key message is, yes, choice, but how, and what does that actually mean for public education? Because if public education is to be and it is universally accessible and inclusive, if that inclusive policy of public education is being really the institution within our society that is going to be universally accessible to all, then why would we start to create these different systems where that creates cost and effectiveness? So I think that would be another key point, is that a lot of these issues around, or the proponents of choice, talk about cost efficiencies, and that maybe charters and private schools can do it more cost effectively. But when you create parallel systems that are operating on top of one another, you create redundancies, and that's a very inefficient way in terms of cost delivery. So that would be one kind of like side note that I would make is that really the most effective approach, is to just outsource? Because we've seen in the United States, where a lot of these models are based upon, we've seen redundancies, we've seen cost and effectiveness, we've seen how actually these different systems just promote and further create segregation within society. Is that really the path that we want to take? I would choose not. I would choose that we create a public system, which is basically the gold standard. And that would take away a lot of this whole notion that we need to outsource to other providers to create that choice, that actually the public education system is the gold standard that can, because we know that it's the system that is designed to be universally accessible for all. There should be no strings attached, whether it's tuition fees, whether it's mandatory uniform costs, whether it's any additional costs that might be a barrier to that choice. Those programs should be accessible within the public education system. That's very long-winded. I know that's not something that you might message or relay in a private conversation, but it is important. And I mean, I know that, yeah, we have a provincial election right around the corner, and that's going to be impactful, and it's going to be significant for some of these issues. But I think the important step, or first step, is just to open up the dialogue and have these conversations and start to really unpack a lot of the preconceived notions, because there's a lot of assumptions that people make around public education versus charter or private schools, and the facts don't necessarily always add up with what some of those preconceived notions are. And I think just to connect it to our previous conversation around moving public from the public school board or public school divisions, those are all, like, they may seem like insignificant minor steps, but that's all leading us further along a path towards privatization. So I think we need to start to put up like our own kind of defense mechanisms to actually unpack and to arm ourselves with knowledge and information, where we can have a more sophisticated, intelligent conversation about what all these minor steps are actually leading us toward, which is a US-based model of privatization.
Harley, I'll give you sort of the last follow-up here, and then we're Thanks for being so gracious, Dr. Riep. I know that we're a little bit over time, but
No
I do
problem. I'll
believe
stay
the
until
conversation is important. So Carly,
course.
go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for that answer. I appreciate a long-winded answer. And what I'm wondering, and I know I believe I know the answers, but I think it'd benefit the group, and that I just want to hear your response, and just for me to get confirmation. Would you say that the decades and decades of drastic underfunding that our public education system has received for the past, let's just round number 60 years, has directly led us to this point where we are in a position for public education to be a target, an easy target, and be and the holes that have been created by that underfunding used against the system and the people working within that system. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question and that comment. And I would just return to that original quote from Noam Chomsky, and it really, there is a method of privatization. There's a blueprint for privatization, and it's to defund, dismantle the system so that people get so angry and so fed up that they think that the only avenues of choice are in the private sector, or they're with some kind of alternative program like a charter school form of provision. This has been tried, tested, and it's been promoted and transplanted across the globe. It has a lot of its roots under Thatcherism in the 1980s with also Ronald Reagan in the United States. These public sector reforms were designed to cripple the public sector, to put it in a chokehold so that there's a lack of social kind of like pushback to try and uphold the public system. So absolutely, decades of underfunding, of I would say misaligned investment or misallocation of funds. This has all contributed to an environment where we're more kind of like open to these ideas of different providers coming on board, because we've seen how the system has been kind of hollowed out to an extent and created this environment where we look to the market, we look to the private sector as basically another approach, which this is the recipe of privatization. So that's why I wanted to kind of start off the presentation looking at that, because that's very much what we've seen. And I mean, 60 years of underfunding, perhaps. I know I've looked more recently since the Klein reforms, and that's a very stark point in time where we've seen these public sector reforms put in place. That's where we've started to see the hollowing out of the public sector, cost-cutting mechanisms, which have been designed to put us on this path. So, you know, when I think about education and educational policy and planning, it's something we should be looking long-term. I mean, it's something we should be looking, like we should be understanding that perspective, that we need to look consecutive generations down the line of what these consequences and changes can lead to. And my hesitation or my kind of why this is problematic is that I don't think that that's the case. I don't think we're looking at what these consequences might lead to in an additional 60 years. I think there's been a lot of nudging that's put us on this path, and it's kind of taking away from the fringes in terms of the public system and trying to rebuild it or prop it up using these kind of market approaches. And so what is that going to look like in another 60 years time? And that's something that I think educational policy and planners, I don't know if there's that kind of long-term range planning in terms of what some of these ramifications can have, but certainly, Klein, and I think it predates that government as well. We have had a one-party system for the longest time in this province, effectively, and there's been chronic underfunding, and certainly that has an impact on the situation that we're in. And I would just buttress that or kind of add to that as well is that we're also at a point in time in our history when public schools are requested to do more than they've ever done. It's not just education, it's now, it's providing a hot meal. It's providing access to mental and physical health supports. It's not just academics and education. Public schools more than ever have been tasked societally to uphold our youth in every capacity. So at the same time that they're being asked to do more and more and more, and our societies become more complex, the demands on our education systems have equally become more and more complex, yet we're seeing this continued kind of hollowing out, this underfunding, this undermining of the public system, which is creating an environment for market-based providers or non-state or private sector providers to come in. And that's something that, again, I think we really need to take stock of what path or what's that going to lead us to, because the consequences could be real, and they are real. You're all educators, you know the types of demands that are being placed on you, but do we have that kind of public will and public support that we need to do that?
Thank you, Dr. Riep, for that last comment and for spending the time here with us tonight. I know a lot of us have learned a lot more detail in terms of the history of privates and charters within Alberta. Just one other thing that I will sort of mention is that you do mention the idea of that choice, but I think it's important to point out that part of the reason why Edmonton doesn't have the level of charters and privates that perhaps Calgary and Southern Alberta do is because one of the superintendents at the time sort of saw where this could have ended up, and I think did a fairly good job of trying to bring in those additional aspects of choice into Edmonton Public, so that there are the different avenues of choice for parents within one public system. So I think it's important to point out that it is doable when done in the right way, but always with the idea that it has to be funded. So with that said, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. It's not an easy task for people that work all day and then come home just to jump onto a Zoom meeting. Well, there's kids or cats screaming in the background. So we do appreciate you being here. We did record tonight's session. We will put it on the Local 37 website. It will not be behind the firewall, so it will be accessible to the public. For those of you that are here tonight, if you'd like to sort of point people in the direction of where to find it, we'll ensure that at least a link to it will be on one of our carousels as it circles around as soon as you get onto that landing page. So thank you again for everyone being here, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone's attendance, and thank you for all the work that you do. Please continue with that and continue to have these conversations, because they're hugely significant and important.
Well, thank you for the work that you do, Dr. Riep. Without your work, we would not have been as enlightened as we were tonight. So we certainly appreciate it.
Of course, and my personal email was there. So if anyone wants to connect, I'm happy to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Night, everyone.
I'm just hanging around to stay connected and just to say thank you again.
That's why I'm hanging around too.
Can I stop the recording, Heather?
That was really